Hello and welcome, everybody. My name is Katie Tweed. I'm the Senior Director for Partnerships and Content here at Canary. Today, we are talking about transmission, and we're really excited for the conversation that we're about to have. For those who don't know, Canary Media is an independent nonprofit newsroom. We cover the transition to clean energy with a solutions focus. We're reporting on decarbonization on everything from electricity to transportation, buildings, and industry. And today, as I said, we're talking about transmission. We want to thank NYPA for sponsoring this free forum. Leading this discussion, even though we are talking about New York transmission, is Karen Wayland. She's the CEO of Gridwise Alliance. She has a great perspective that spans far beyond New York. She's also the CEO and founder at KW Energy Strategies. She's been in this space a long time and the perfect person to lead this conversation. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over for Karen. I'll note that we will have some time at the end for questions. You'll see a Q&A box, so feel free during the conversation to put them in there. If you have nothing you want to ask, but you want to, participate, there is an upvote function for the questions as well. And so we hope that you'll use that. And without further ado, Karen, it's all yours.
Thanks, Katie. So there are a number of reports over the last few years that have talked about the need for thousands of miles of new transmission across the country in order to bring new renewables capacity into load areas. And we also know that it can take on the order of 10 to 15 years to build new transmission if the permitting and approval process actually goes through. And yet in New York, transmission developers have been able to build thousands of new miles of transmission, as well as upgrade existing transmission to improve efficiency, reliability, and to meet New York's clean energy goals. So our panel today is a group of experts from New York who have been working on this process of building new transmission. And we want to really explore how New York has addressed the structural, institutional, financing barriers to new and upgraded transmission, and how other regions can learn from New York's success. So I'm joined by Emily Nelson, who's the Executive Vice President at New York ISO, dairy farmer and Northern New York Agricultural Development Program co-chair John Greenwood of Canton, New York. And we will hopefully have Phil Toya, who's the President of Development at the New York Power Authority, or NYPA, with us. We had him in the beginning when we were behind in the green room, the virtual green room, but just as we were about to go on, he was interrupted by a fire alarm in his building. So we were hoping that Phil will be joining us. But if not, this is a panel that has been deeply involved in all of the processes in New York. And so I think we'll have a really rich discussion. So let me remind you again of what Katie said, which is that we will be taking Q&A at the end. I'm going to save a lot of room for that because I understand that this is going to be a lively group that will have lots of questions. So you can, on the top of your screen, you'll see a Q&A and you can type your questions in there. I'll be looking for them. And at the end, I'll save 10 to 15 minutes for those questions. And again, you can upvote the questions as you go if you see anything interesting. So let me start with you, Emily, and let you talk about New York's goals and the investments in infrastructure that are necessary to meet that goal. And then how you work with the state, because you are not the state, you're the independent system operator. So how you work with the state of New York to plan for that infrastructure, which then sets the stage for what Phil is doing. And I see Phil is trying to join, so we'll keep watching. But Emily, can talk about the goals and the infrastructure that's necessary to meet those goals.
Sure. Thank you, Karen. And I hope everyone's doing well today. Pleasure to be here on this panel. I think that probably many of you are aware of the energy goals, the energy policy that's been established here in New York State. Certainly the objectives that are in place for the state are very ambitious and multifaceted for sure. So a couple of years ago, the New York legislature passed the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, and that really established the path for us to achieve here in New York. There's many different facets to this legislation, and I'll just highlight a few. 70% of New York's electricity supply needs to come from renewable resources by 2030. And by 2040, there needs to be a zero-emission electric grid. There's also a number of specific resource targets, and some of these targets have been updated through the years. So there are specific goals for solar, the establishment of an offshore wind, as well as storage, all of these resources being essential to achieve a zero emission grid in the future. There's also economy-wide objectives with greenhouse gas emission reductions that are required by 2050, reducing by 85%. I believe that's to 1990 levels. And so with this, what I'm hoping to convey most simply is that the mandates are very clear, although there certainly are unknowns on how to achieve some aspects of these goals. That being said, the duration and magnitude of what needs to be achieved is well established, and I think that really provides the platform for the investment signals that are needed, both on the resource side as well as the transmission side, which of course is the topic of today's discussion. So with that, really interested in hearing everyone's perspective today, including your perspective, John, as a farmer, and how collaboration is so essential to achieve the projects that have been slated to achieve the energy goals.
Well, I'm excited that Phil was able to join us. Phil, are you able to, why don't you introduce yourself so we know that we can hear you?
Hi, thank you, Catherine. I'm Phil Toya, president of NYPA Development. I apologize. Had a little fire alarm go off in the building, so I am sitting in a parking garage trying to do this. So I apologize for the background and any noise that may come out. We'll try to get through this.
Well, you sound good. You sound good. So Emily set the stage for the investments that you're making in transmission construction. You're not the only transmission developers, but you are building hundreds of miles of new transmission as well as upgrading your existing transmission. Can you talk about the scale of the work that you're doing and why, and maybe give us some insights into what other transmission developers are doing as well?
Sure. It's a very exciting time to be in this business, especially in New York. I've been in the business in New York for over 30 years, and the development that's taking place now in the past few years is more than I saw in the first 27, 28 years. So if you look at NYPA's projects, we have a number of projects where we're rebuilding existing transmission lines, our Smart Path Connect projects, which are under construction now. We also have our Central East Energy Connect project, which is running in central New York area over towards the Albany area. That was through the AC proceedings, through the New York ISO competitive process. We're also rebuilding sections of our Y49 cable, Long Island Cross Sound cable. But you look beyond that, New York Transco has several projects in development. Segment B, which was part of the AC proceedings case. NextEra energized a line in Western New York, and Con Ed also has some construction going on. So just across the state in general, a tremendous amount of development that's under construction or in development. And then you look at the competitive processes that are also ongoing within New York, upcoming throughout the existing competitive process as well as future competitive processes within New York.
So for those of you who are not from the state of New York, it is such an interesting state. I grew up in the neighboring state of Connecticut on a farm, John. I don't know if you knew that, but what I find so interesting about New York is that it has one of the most densely populated cities in the country and suburbs around, but absolutely stunningly gorgeous, very rural area in much of the upper part of New York. So it's a really diverse population and land use. And John, you as a dairy farmer, I want to ask you about what it's like to have energy infrastructure on your property, what it means for your farm, and how you manage your land.
Okay, yeah. So to a little background, maybe we crop about 3,500 acres. We're a dairy farm. We've got 3 lines actually going across us in parallel, a 765 and 2 345s. And so they cover a good share of our land, and having to work around the towers is the thing that no farmer wants. So the 765 was actually built right when I was getting started. And And then the 345 lines were just upgraded from wood poles to mono poles. And that's our most recent experience. And I think, the biggest thing as a farmer is when these lines are being built is working with the powers that be right from the get-go. I know the power authority on this rebuild was very good in coming out, showing me the plans, what they were planning on doing, asking where I would like them to come in, rather than just using the existing right-of-ways, what worked best for our farm, and really trying to work with us. And I think that's key, is having that communication. And actually, as these lines are planned, even if they can look and maybe you move a tower one way or another, to help work. Working around towers is no fun. These monopoles were a big improvement. Basically, we traded 3 towers for 1, and they're much easier to work around. So a real improvement. But it's really, the communication is the key. That them coming in and asking, how do you want us to access these poles? Can we use your road, or do you want us to go across the fields? Looking at our cutting schedules, actually, they even looked at and kind of reworked some of their working schedule where they could, to allow us to continue to crop. Because that's the big thing. They came in and they said, we'll pay for crop damage. And I said, well, my cows can't eat dollar bills. It's the loss of the crops, and even more so than that, when you go through a middle of a field, you're creating, in essence, 2 fields, which creates a lot of inefficiencies in how you have to work the field.
Yeah, and it compacts the ground and creates other issues. Yeah. That's interesting, because you always think about the permitting process, which is the initial stage of infrastructure development. And it's, can I even get on your land? But really what you're talking about is an ongoing relationship with the transmission owners, because they have to have access over many years.
Yes, and that helps build the trust. Then I think when they want to come back and do things, if a line needs repair, they've come in and said, we've got this line in your field, how best to access it, so we'll do minimal damage. And those are the types of things that are appreciated, and having phone numbers while they're building. So if something comes up, you can make a phone call and get some immediate action. And, there's always unexpected. We had one incident where they were doing the rebuild, and we started opening up in a field on a weekend. I'd had extra help lined up, and the lines were dropped in the field, and we came to a screeching halt, and a cell phone call, and 15 minutes later, and the project manager is there and assured me they would get the lines removed as quick as they can. And a day and a half later, the lines were out of the field, and we were able to keep going. So, it's those little things that make the big difference.
Yeah. Let me go back to Emily a little bit and talk to you as the transmission operator, where reliability is your first priority. That how does NYISO balance the clean energy goals with the reliability requirements?
Thanks for the question, Karen, and expanding on some of what I just heard from John. This opportunity to coordinate and figure out solutions to these very real life issues is really important. If we look at the energy policy we have for the state, and we look at the energy production that we had in 2021, we have 89% of our electricity needs served downstate by fossil, and upstate only 6% by fossil. So you can understand that a lot of our zero emission resources are located upstate. So the ability to build transmission down to the New York City metropolitan area will be critically important to transform our energy profile as a state. And with respect to reliability, certainly there is a tremendous opportunity, a challenge, if you will, to meet the requirements of having a reliable and clean energy transition. And it's very heartening to hear that, in general, I don't think there's any debate on that point. The reason that this transformation is going to be so difficult is because virtually everyone realizes that as we electrify greater portions of our economy, transportation, heating and buildings, that it's going to be more important than ever to have a reliable electric grid. So I don't think anyone is interested or willing to compromise on that. Tactically, what the New York ISO can do to help inform that discussion is to produce, first of all, to be engaged in the conversation, but certainly to produce a variety of studies that are future-looking and scenario-based, that evaluate the transformation and the potential challenges associated with that. So you can certainly take a look at NISO.com and you'll see a number of studies. Most recently, the reliability needs analysis, which is evaluating reliability needs over a 10-year basis, but looking out even further to consider scenarios and see where we are experiencing narrowing reliability needs that or margins that will need to be resolved by a combination of solutions on the resource side as well as transmission side. So we certainly see an important piece of this, making sure that everyone's at the table, engaged in these discussions, being open-minded and clear-eyed on where there are challenges, and understanding those far enough in advance that they can be resolved before there's any compromise on the reliability side.
And Phil, we always talk about the three-legged stool of transmission building, which is the finance, cost allocation, financing, and siting and permitting. And often the first, financing and cost allocation. Cost allocation is not easy, but you almost can get the financing and cost allocation right and then really be stuck with siting and permitting issues. So how has NYPA been able to successfully permit so much new transmission, and what underpins that success?
Sure. So I think, the three main issues that have really helped us, and I'll start with, I think, the core issue, and it goes back to what John said. We have our local presence. If you look at NYPA's transmission assets, they run from Western New York and Northern New York across down to Central New York and across towards the Southeastern region. So we have that presence and we have that local understanding. Many of our people in the field, whether it's our line crews, our real estate people, our vegetation management people, they are from those local communities. They have that local understanding, and they work closely with our community affairs people who are also local to the area. So we have that local understanding. The individuals in the field that are representing us, whether it's in our O&M practices or on these construction activities, they're out there, they interact with the people. So they have that local understanding. Next, and I think this just builds upon that local understanding, is we have a long-term view and a long-standing operational experience in those regions. So we know the particular areas. Our practices are all built upon that long-term view, whether it's our integrated vegetation management program, where we're looking at utilizing, low growth trees and vegetation are right away, so we don't have to do as much cutting as well as herbicide treatment. So that helps from a pollinator standpoint, as well as promoting the local aspects of the vegetation, all the way through our asset management program. So we have that long-term view. So that helps from the regulatory standpoint, from the permitting practice, because we have that reputation, and we do what we say we're going to do. Along those lines, then, working with the local communities and the landowners, we commit to what we're going to do. We work with them. We make mistakes, but I think the point there is that you work with them, as John indicated, when we do make those mistakes, and you address them as quickly as possible so that the landowners are happy with the work we're doing. And then lastly on that, I think that you look at the apologize for that. You look at the goals of the state and what we're doing from our existing O&M, as well as rebuilding these assets and building new assets. It's all geared towards those state goals, meeting the state CLCPA goals, the environmental goals. So there's that focus. And when you look at all of those combined, It really helps with the regulatory process, the permitting, the stakeholder management. And when we go to permit a new line, whether it's the existing lines where we're rebuilding them, or if you look at a project like Clean Path New York, which is in the Article 7 process now, that reputation, as well as that singular focus on the mission of decarbonizing New York, it's really helped us through that stakeholder management process in getting the projects permitted.
I just want to remind the audience that you can use the Q&A function there to throw questions into the sidebar there, which I will be looking at in a little bit. John, from your perspective, not only as a farmer, but someone who's worked with farmers around the state, and of course, it's not just dairy. There's a quite diverse agricultural presence across New York, including a growing set of wine producers, even. And you've been working with the Farm Bureau. What's necessary to understand the farmer's interest when new transmission is proposed?
I think the farmer's biggest concern is always where the tower is going to be located, because those are obstructions in the field that have to be worked around. And most farmers are looking to take out hedgerows, take out stone piles, to make their fields clear of obstructions so that they're easier to work. And so that is the biggest concern. And so anything that can be done to try to avoid cropland or place towers in the least obstructive way is what needs to be done. But you're never going to find a farmer that says, "Oh yeah, build a transmission line on my farm." I mean, that's not going to happen.
Can you talk about some of the best practices that you think that you've experienced with NYPA and other transmission developers that would be useful for people in other regions to hear about?
Well, I think the watching the use of the pads now, so that they aren't driving over the ground and creating compaction. We've got tile in our fields, and one of our big concerns was when they were putting in these last set of towers. If you hit a tile line, it needs to be identified right away so that can be fixed for drainage. And so when they take those types of steps, that's critical. And when they're drilling, sometimes they would hit a spring, and to make sure that water is diverted and doesn't create a wet spot in your field. It's the little things really that add up. The access roads that they put in, making sure that we have crossings to get to the other side on our fields, and just trying to be cognizant of the farmers' needs. We have threatened species up here, and there was fencing being put up to keep them out of the right of way as required. But they were going to do it in hayfields that they weren't going to get to well into the growing year. And after talking with them and working with them, they agreed that they could put them up later so that we could get off our first 2 cuttings of hay, which is it's those. So I think it's those little things that kind of help smooth the path. Although nobody's going to say, "Yeah, I'm raising my hand, put a tower on my land."
Well, Joe in the audience is asking, how frequently does the utility have to enter the farm property for maintenance, and how much does that interfere with your farm operations?
It's not real frequent, and it should go right down. I mean, the old wood towers were really old, so every once in a while you'd have one that would break, or we actually had one that a structure broke and caught fire, so they had access. So things do happen, but every time it's happened, they've asked the best way to get there and do minimal damage. But it's infrequent, and I expect now with the new lines that we probably won't see them for years. So that's the hope.
Phil, let me ask you about building new capacity versus using grid enhancing technologies to increase capacity versus where you decide to put storage. I mean, all of these things would require access to someone's land, but they also influence the extent of the process that you have to go through. But can you talk about the decisions that you make in terms of upgrading existing lines versus building new transmission?
Sure. I think one of the things that when you look at the projects that were initially started from a development and construction standpoint, a lot of it was rebuilding existing lines. trying to get more out of them, utilizing existing rights of way, and increasing capacity. Now we're starting to look at that next phase where you look at the Clean Path New York project, where we're adding another circuit to an existing right of way to build upon that. So, trying to get as much out of the existing infrastructure, whether it's existing transmission lines or rights of way. And I think the next phase, when you start to look at the development, the projects are getting larger and more complex when you start to look at where the New York ISO is identifying the system constraints, where the renewables are being built. But it's always a balance of trying to get as much out of existing infrastructure and trying to meet the system needs from a reliability standpoint as well as that expansion standpoint. So it's just, it's going through all of the technical analysis, but also looking at the landowner issues, the community issues, to determine what's best overall from a system as well as a stakeholder perspective.
We've got a couple questions that speak to what we're seeing as we bring more and more distributed energy resources on this growing connection between the distribution system and the transmission system. And certainly when we think about FERC Order 2222, which speaks to how aggregated distributed energy resources can be brought into the bulk power system and sold on the wholesale markets, that we are seeing this increase in connection between distribution and transmission. Emily, can you talk a bit about how New York ISO is thinking about the transmission, the bulk power system as it relates to distributed energy, or to the distribution system?
Certainly. So one of the roles for the New York ISO, we already hit upon reliability, but creating a competitive marketplace. So as these technologies emerge, there's opportunities for them to provide services that enhance reliability and really incent that investment going forward. That's a core part of what the New York ISO does. So Karen, you referenced 2222. And even before FERC Order 2222, the New York ISO was working with our stakeholders to establish a DER approach that would allow resources that were coming into the distribution level to aggregate and participate at a wholesale level to the extent that they could meet the requirements to do so. So we think that's an important part of making sure that we are fully utilizing all of the resources, effectively managing the transmission and the transmission constraints to deliver power as effectively as possible to maximize the output of renewable as a marginally zero energy source. And so this is a really fundamental part of the transition. And we will have that participation model, is what we call it, available next year to really expand participation in the wholesale market level.
Phil, is there anything you want to add to that? Because what I find so fascinating about storage is that you can put it anywhere on the grid. It can be behind the meter, it can be on the distribution system. It's being used to address transmission constraints in parts of the country where they can't build new transmission right away. So can you want to add anything on batteries and storage in particular?
Well, I think when you look at it, and to Emily's point earlier, you look at what's going on in New York, I think everybody, all of the stakeholders recognize the tasks that are in front of us. And I think the competitive processes that we have, whether you're looking at the FERC Order 1000 processes that the New York ISO conducts, or the NYSERDA Tier 4, those solicitations, that competitive process, I think, does help determine which projects are the best. That the competitive nature of that is really driving the right decisions within the system. And I think, the other part of that is it's recognized that there's many, many different opportunities and solutions across the market for the various stakeholders to help us reach our goals. So I think that's been another big advantage for New York as far as advancing these goals.
I have to ask, although I'm really surprised that nobody has asked yet, about the interconnection process and about where there might be some barriers or stickiness in the interconnection process, and how New York is addressing that?
I think maybe I should step in first. So interconnection across the country is an important issue, and it's a challenging one. There are many aspects in New York where we have established really an effective approach to interconnection, but there is plenty of room for improvement. And when you consider the energy policy that we're talking about, not only on the transmission side, but on the supply resource side, it is tremendous. So currently we have about 37 gigawatts of generating capacity, and the numbers vary by study, but looking out to 2040, that's going to need to grow to 111 to 124 gigawatts. So that's just tremendous. And so part of what we're working through now is a significant uptick in the number of resources that are coming through the interconnection process. And we need to, quite frankly, find better ways to get the core analysis that's needed for reliability across all aspects of the transmission and distribution system, very efficiently evaluated and finalized, and allow for these projects to continue through the process just as quickly as possible. There is review going on by FERC right now on how the interconnection process can be improved. Certainly from the New York ISO's perspective, we are looking for that regional flexibility so we can retain the aspects of our process that are working well, and then work with stakeholders here in New York to figure out how to improve other aspects. This goes across communication, project management, technical analysis, kind of top to bottom. And I think one of the most important things is having parties involved very willing to engage and figure out how to do things better. And that's exactly where the New York ISO is.
There's a question that I think a fair number of people are interested in for you, John, about the kinds of incentives that would make farmers more likely to engage with these projects and what might be missing from the current structure.
I don't know if there's a real incentive other than, if possible, to approach early and ask where they could best put a structure. You know, if you can move it a few hundred feet one way or another, it can make a huge difference. But otherwise, incentive-wise, I mean, we'll pay big dollars to move stone walls and rock piles out of our fields so we don't have to work around them. So, you know, I think obviously money always talks a little, and it would help to pay more. I guess one of my pet peeves was like when the 765 they appraised the land and they came up with the value of the land. That's not really indicative of the harm that tower is causing to your operation. And so I think, you know, if we want to incentivize, there needs to be a better model of how to compensate for the obstruction that's placed in the field.
And what you receive is an ongoing rent payment per?
No. They're basically paying for 90%, I believe, was of the value of the land. It's kind of a right of way, but it's a one-time fee. But it doesn't really compensate for. I mean, no one would voluntarily accept that amount of money to put an obstruction in their field.
Another question from Samantha is, what are the most exciting new technologies to support expanding transmission capabilities? That may be for you, Phil?
Yeah, so there's always technological advances, and we're looking at that. I think, you know, there are various components, and if you look at New York, we've implemented some of these in the last several years. We have our Marcy South Series compensation project, which did increase capacity on some of the lines in New York. We also have other technologies. There's also newer technologies in conductors that do allow for increased power flows on those lines, increased current capacity. So there's just a continually evolving technology aspect to it. But I think, a lot of that, also a lot of the other work that needs to take place is building new infrastructure. You look at the transmission expansion that took place previously, it was a lot for reliability, local needs. Now with the development of renewables, it's just, I think it's, as I stated earlier, looking in any and all options that make sense from that competitive process. And I think that's helped driving the best of solutions in New York.
And you're in an interesting part of the country where there are a lot of small states to your east and some bigger states and another big independent system operator to your west. And you're also part of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. There's a question about how New York is working with other states to build out an interregional transmission grid. And are there discussions around that topic? Particularly, I think there's probably some interest in not just that question in general, but how it relates to offshore wind development as well.
Phil, you want me to start and then maybe you can add to it. So here in New York, we have a long history of making sure that we are really building out our capability with neighboring ISOs and RTOs, all of those areas that you mentioned, Karen. It's really fundamental to having a reliable power grid. It allows for things like transferring power at times where maybe you're experiencing different weather conditions or unexpected events. It absolutely enhances the reliability of the grid. And it also allows for the most cost-effective exchange of power across the regions for those very, very same reasons. So over 10 years ago, we really built out our ability to exchange power on a much more granular basis. And we're ahead of the curve, quite frankly, in New York with requirements that subsequently came from FERC because all of these principles are fundamental to integrating greater volumes of renewable resources that have intermittent characteristics. So this is an absolute focus, and the coordination from a reliability and markets perspective is very much there. And Karen, you already mentioned Reggie. So that's a good indication of the environmental coordination as well.
Yeah, I think you look at New York has had that experience with interconnections. NYPA, we have interconnections with Ontario, with Quebec, with Vermont. So, those are existing. So we're always looking at those opportunities. The 765 kV line that John mentioned earlier, that is eventually an interconnection in the northern part of New York with Hydro-Quebec. You look at the new line that TDI is building, the Champlain Hudson Power Express. So I think, to Emily's point, that it is crucial. And as you develop more of these resources, that geographic diversity is important from the renewable standpoint. And I think we will see more of that, just how it plays out. I think at this point in time, a lot of the existing projects, again, have been focused on that internal within New York, but I think you will see more development across those borders with other states or potentially with Canada as well.
Here's a great question about legislation. And that Senator Manchin has got a bill that he's trying to move to address permitting process. And then the question is about many legislators across the country are trying to figure out ways to best site transmission projects and remove some of the regulatory hurdles. For example, some have suggested making transmission projects fall solely under national interests, taking away state regulatory oversight. And the question for you, Phil, is what do you think would be the best measure to better site transmission projects?
Well, I mean, speaking from the New York perspective, I think our siting, our permitting process, the Article 7 process, the stakeholder process that goes along with that, it's working. Like I said, you look at the number of projects that are in either that permitting process now or in construction. I think it's working for New York. I don't want to speak for other areas of the country because I do think some of this is dependent on those local needs. And I think New York's process is working. But I do think that raising the importance of transmission, I think from a national perspective, because it is overall, it adds a lot of value from an economic development standpoint, meeting clean energy goals, as well as reinforcing the grid from a reliability and resiliency standpoint.
And I would imagine, John, that any efforts to reform the eminent domain process would not go over well.
No, I mean, nobody likes to do it, but I think it goes back to, at some point we know we have to have transmission lines. Nobody wants them on their property, but if we can compensate the landowner, look at where we place the structures, look at the type of structures. I mean, the monopoles compared to the four-legged 765 towers are much less intrusive and much easier to work around. So if the transmission lines can be built in a more friendly way and friendly design, that all those things will help.
Here's a question from someone about whether you have any thoughts about the Champlain Hudson Power Express, which just started construction, and what its importance is in the overall transmission picture.
Well, I'm happy to share that I referenced earlier in this panel discussion the reliability needs assessment, and one aspect of the energy policy certainly is scaling up renewables, building out transmission. Another aspect of the energy policy is scaling down the use of fossil resources. And we have a number of peakers, is what we call them, that are due to retire starting in really right now in 2023, and then an additional set in 2025. This is actually driven in part by requirements that go beyond New York's CLCPA that I mentioned. But fundamentally, what we're seeing is we're seeing narrowing reliability margins as a lot of this investment we've been talking about, especially on the supply side, is still under construction, still being built. So we absolutely need these transmission projects to come into fruition. We need the supply resources to materialize. And what we call out in our reliability needs assessment report is that certainly in that 2025 to 2026 timing, the Champlain Hudson project is an important piece of reestablishing the reliability margins we need on the bulk power system.
So this is not necessarily a question about a new transmission or even upgrading transmission, but I think given what happened in Moore County, North Carolina, there's a question in here about thinking about the security of our transmission lines and how you go about what the implications are for the growing threats of physical disruptions, physical attacks on the grid, and how you might be preparing for that. Tell us all your secrets, Phil.
Well, I think the key there is, again, building the infrastructure, reinforcing it, looking at it from a resiliency standpoint. It's not just the physical threats like that. There are environmental threats. So planning for that, and to Emily's point on the planning, the reliability needs assessment, the system is designed, planned, and built from a transmission perspective to be able to handle disruptions in a transmission line. So again, making sure that we're planning the system to meet those reliability needs and understanding, the resiliency and recovery efforts to make sure we can respond to whatever the issue is, whether it's an environmental, hurricane, any other storm, or a physical event like what took place in North Carolina.
There's an interesting question about whether it's ever been proposed. John, you mentioned a few times that you're constantly clearing your own land and dealing with managing the land. I know that on my farm, I would love to get somebody to come in and clear out all the old barbed wire that's mixed up with all the old stone walls and things and the down trees. And so the question is, has it ever been proposed partnering new projects with clearing initiatives for existing obstructions? Would that help?
I think it would help. I mean, we've actually toyed with the idea of asking if the Power Authority would pay us to clear underneath the lines where it's, partially cleared to make land and usable land, and then they wouldn't have to pay to keep the brush down and keep it cleared. So, I think any kind of ideas like that and innovative ideas would certainly help.
Okay. Well, there are more questions than we have time. I see that it's 2:45. So I just want to thank everybody for joining us and thank Phil, Emily, and John for your insights. And that we could go on and on. This is a really important topic, and I hope that it has resonance beyond the state of New York. So thank you to everybody for joining, and thanks to our speakers, and thanks to Canary for this important discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.